This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 121 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we are going to talk about higher order thinking tasks, more specifically about two really common mistakes that teachers make when they think they're assigning a higher order thinking task. The mobiles hang from the ceiling like jewelry, filling Ms. Jackson's language arts classroom with bright, twirling colors. They make a pretty canopy over the room, and if you look closer at the individual dangly bits on each mobile, you'll see that they contain words. Alliteration, says one, and below it hang 4 more pieces of paper that give examples of alliteration. Personification, says another. Simile, metaphor, onomatopoeia. They're figurative language mobiles. Ms. Jackson's students spent 2 full class periods working on them, and many even took theirs home to finish them before they were put up for display. When she wrote those 2 days into her lesson plans, Ms. Jackson thought she was adding higher order thinking to her students' learning. After all, they were creating something, weren't they? Well, yes and no. Yes, they created mobiles with wire hangers, construction paper, markers, and glue. But they didn't actually create anything with figurative language, like a piece of original writing, for example. The mobiles, in fact, represent no higher order thinking at all. It's kind of a given that most teachers want their students to be doing rigorous, challenging work. Ask any teacher, is it your goal to simply have students regurgitate facts in your class? And every time, the answer will probably be no. And yet, that exact thing is happening more often than we realize. It's not for lack of trying. For years, teachers have consulted with their Bloom's flip charts and DOK wheels to choose the verbs that are meant to represent higher levels of thinking. In a lot of cases, though, while the right verbs are being used, the tasks they represent aren't actually on the level teachers think they are. Over the years, I have seen teachers make 2 specific mistakes with higher order thinking tasks more often than any other. So in this episode, I'm going to drill down and focus just on those 2 mistakes. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Kidum for sponsoring this episode. Administrators, you spend hours designing and revising curriculum to ensure it's rigorous and standards aligned. Once it's out of your hands, how do you measure its effectiveness without having to wait until the end of the school year? And teachers, you spend hours contextualizing and individualizing lessons to meet the needs of your students. How do you show off those personal touches to your administrators, especially if they improve student outcomes? With Kidum, both administrators and teachers gain a set of unique tools designed specifically for them. Kidum Academy helps school and district leaders build systems of continuous improvement by allowing you to design, measure, and act on curriculum in real time across classrooms and schools. And with Kidum Classroom, teachers can find thousands of free teaching resources, share work with students, and communicate feedback on assignments. With Kidum, school and district leaders can support the work happening in classrooms in a more effective and timely manner. And most importantly, they can let teachers do what they do best. To get a 2-week free trial, visit go.kidum.co. Kidum is Kiddom. go.kidum.co/free trial. Support also comes from Chill Expeditions. How do you maximize student travel experiences? You partner with outstanding experiential educators in the field. This is what Chill Expeditions does. Partner with great teachers like you to customize student travel experiences. Chill Expeditions' expert trip planning team, highly trained field guides, and visionary local collaborators unburden you to maximize student travel. Getting kids out of their comfort zones is important. But Chill Expeditions does more, working to help kids expand their comfort zones so they can more ably navigate this challenging world. Founded by innovative teachers who know how to get the best out of kids when traveling, Chill Expeditions has the finest professional field educators in the business because the educators you travel with matter. Learn more at chillexpeditions.com. The Cult of Pedagogy podcast is part of the Education Podcast Network. The EPN family now includes 30 different podcasts, and each one is focused on education. Check out all of the EPN podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com. Now let's talk about higher order thinking, specifically 2 really common mistakes teachers make with it. First, let's make sure we're on the same page with our terms. When people talk about higher order thinking, what do they mean exactly? The answer can be different depending on who you ask. First, there's the question of which framework you're using. Bloom's taxonomy is commonly used by teachers to classify learning outcomes, as is Webb's depth of knowledge framework. Other teachers prefer the solo taxonomy created by John Biggs. For the sake of efficiency, I am going to stick to Bloom's taxonomy for this discussion. More specifically, I'll be referring to the revised Bloom's taxonomy, which was published by Anderson and Krathwohl in 2001. And a lot of people don't really realize that Bloom's taxonomy was revised in 2001. So some of the terms might throw you off a little bit. So I'm going to read the levels for the revised Bloom's taxonomy. Level 1 is the remember level. And this is where students are just retrieving knowledge from memory. Level 2 is understand. This is where students are constructing some meaning, sort of recalling, but also summarizing, giving examples, that type of thing. Level 3 is apply, which is to carry out or use a procedure in a given situation. Level 4 is analyze, which is to break material into its constituent parts and determine how the parts relate to one another and to an overall structure or purpose. Level 5 is evaluate, which is making judgments based on criteria and standards. And level 6 is create, putting elements together to form a coherent or functional whole, reorganizing elements into a new pattern or structure. Okay? So again, 1 is remember, 2, understand, 3, apply, 4, analyze, 5, evaluate, and 6, create. So if we just look at Bloom's, which levels would be seen as representing higher order thinking? Logically, it would seem that any task that goes above the remember level, where students simply recall information, would be considered higher because it's higher than that lowest level. But in many discussions of higher order thinking, this label is often reserved for just the 3 highest levels: analyze, evaluate, and create. So for now, when I say higher order, I'll be referring to those 3 levels. By the way, there is nothing inherently wrong with the lower levels. Taking in information, understanding it, and applying it are all necessary and vital parts of a good education. But if our students work only at those levels day in and day out, they aren't becoming good thinkers. Without regular opportunities to pull ideas apart, evaluate texts and situations, and use what they learn to develop new ideas, they aren't going to be able to do much with the information they learn at the lower levels, especially once they're out of school. On top of that, a course that only asks students to receive information and spit it back out is really, really boring. If we want engaged students who actually care about what they're learning, we have to ask them to do more than just regurgitate. Okay, so let's get into these 2 common mistakes. When teachers I have worked with plan learning experiences and they want to include higher order thinking activities, they most often tend to make 2 particular mistakes. Avoiding these 2 errors should go a long way toward making the higher order label more accurate, sort of universally. Mistake number 1 is thinking a task is at the analyze level when it's really at the understand level. Because we use the word analyze so often in conversation, its meaning has gotten slippery. Someone could say, analyze that painting, and another person might answer by giving a basic description of the painting and offering an opinion about its meaning. True analysis goes deeper. breaking a whole into parts and looking at how those parts impact the whole, differentiating relevant from irrelevant information, organizing ideas within a particular structure, or recognizing underlying bias, values, or point of view. I spoke with author and instructional coach Julie Stern to get her opinion on some of these things and make sure I was heading in the right direction. And here's what she told me about this first mistake. To truly analyze a painting, for example, we would require that students do one of the above, the looking at how the parts impact the whole, differentiating relevant from irrelevant information, and so on, such as discussing how the use of colors, materials, or other artistic technique impact one another, or how they impact the overall meaning of the painting. For the analysis to be legitimate, Stern adds, we also have to be careful that the situation presented is one that we have not previously taught in class. She says we have to be sure that students are not merely remembering and repeating our analysis of the painting, the novel, the war, etc., that we studied together in class. Because then that would just be a remembering task. They're just remembering what it was you said. Instead, students can demonstrate their analytical skills by analyzing a completely new painting, for example. Now, because we don't always think of analysis with this tighter definition, we sometimes think that certain tasks are at the analyze level when they're actually at the understand level. It's not surprising we make this mistake. The understand level encompasses a surprising number of cognitive tasks that go well beyond simple recall of facts. Anderson and Krathwohl's revised taxonomy includes interpreting, exemplifying, classifying, summarizing, inferring, comparing, and explaining, all within the understand level. So understand level work can be rigorous and challenging. It should be a regular part of the work students do. But there are much higher levels of thinking that we can build into our classroom routines on a regular basis. Mistake number 2, and I see this one the most often, is thinking a task is at the create level when it's actually a remember or understand task with a pretty package. Teachers assign all kinds of projects that they believe hit the create level of Bloom's. Posters, dioramas, booklets, mobiles, for example. And while it may appear on the surface that students are actively creating something new, in a lot of cases, they are still working at a very low cognitive level, merely reassembling facts and delivering them in a pretty package. Technology can make this problem worse. Students may be tasked with creating a video, a Prezi, or even a digital game. But if the content of the end product is little more than a rehashing of facts, that task is still at a lower level. Again, this is what Julie Stern said about this problem. Create, according to the revised Bloom's, requires students to organize elements into a pattern, structure, or product that is new or has not previously existed. One way to think about it is that analysis is breaking elements apart to discuss how the parts impact each other or the larger structure. And create is putting the elements back together in a new way or a new situation. So, when studying animal habitats, having students build a clay model of a habitat for an animal you studied in class might feel like a creative project, but in reality, students are just making a 3D representation of facts they already learned. Here's more from Julie Stern. When we ask students to create a poster, brochure, video, or digital game that creatively explains the main points discussed in class, we are not reaching a higher level of thinking. Again, it might be helpful to think about a new context or situation, even a hypothetical one, not simply a new product. If we want students to create a habitat for an animal, it should be a different type of animal than ones we previously discussed. Here's another way to look at it. Work at the create level doesn't really need glue, markers, scissors, or technology to qualify as a create task. If you remove all the creative trappings and just look at the mental work students are doing, it should still involve creating something new with the content they're learning. So those are the two mistakes. What I would like to do now is look at these mistakes within the context of a more complete set of lesson plans, followed by another set that does a better job of building in higher order thinking. So we're going to do a before and then an after set of lessons. So here is our case study. Tony is an 8th grade social studies teacher who is designing a set of lessons on the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution. His state standards say that students should be able to do the following in regards to the Bill of Rights. And these are just two simple standards. First off, they should be able to identify and explain the rights granted to all citizens by the Bill of Rights. And secondly, they should be able to identify and evaluate contemporary issues that involve the rights granted by the Bill of Rights. So we'll start with Tony's original lesson plans, the ones he has used to teach the Bill of Rights for several years now. And then we're going to look at another set of plans that come from the Bill of Rights Institute that tackles the same basic goals, but pushes students to higher levels of thinking about the material. These are both about 1-week lesson plans, and I'm basing that on class periods of about 45 to 60 minutes, something in that range. Okay, so here is the before set of plans. This is a 1-week sort of mini unit. The first activity is a lecture with a handout, and this is going to take about 1 class period. Tony gives a lecture with a PowerPoint that lists and explains all 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. During the lecture, students complete a handout where they fill in blanks about the Bill of Rights. The information they add comes directly from the lecture: numbers, names, definitions, and examples of each of the 10 amendments. So that's the first activity, a lecture with a handout. This activity is at the remember level of Bloom's. Students are simply taking in the information and recording it. That's it. So that's day 1. The second activity is student websites, and this is going to take 3.5 class periods, so the bulk of the week. Here's the task. Each student chooses one right from the Bill of Rights and creates a 4-page website about it, where they have to provide the original text of the amendment, define the right, add 2 pictures that show the right being exercised, and create a list of at least 4 links to articles that show the right either being violated or exercised. Now, Tony believes this activity is at the create level because students are creating their own websites. But because they're just defining the amendment, giving examples, and linking to other examples without any commentary, the work never rises above the understand level. Unfortunately, because students are learning new technology in order to do this project, it takes most of the week to complete, which makes it a strong candidate for the Grecian urn label, a task that consumes far more time than it gives back in terms of learning. And I talk about the Grecian urn or the Grecian urn lesson in episode 54, if you're not familiar with that yet. So we've got a lecture, which is at the remember level. We've got the students doing their own websites for 3.5 days, which is at the remember/understand level. And then at the end of the week, sort of at the end of the last day, because it only takes about half a class period, is a test. The test asks students to correctly identify the number of each amendment, then match the amendment with descriptions of people exercising their rights. The final extended response question asks students to give 3 examples from their daily lives where they exercise one of the rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights and discuss why each right is important to them. While most of this test is at the remember level, Tony believes the final question is at the analyze level because students are analyzing the relationship between the Bill of Rights and their own lives. In fact, they are really just giving examples of the rights in their own lives, and exemplifying is at the understand level. Okay, so now let's look at the after lesson plans. This revised version contains more higher order thinking. It comes from the Bill of Rights lesson plan, which is offered free as part of the Being American series offered by the Bill of Rights Institute. And you can find that at billofrightsinstitute.org. Now, on my website, I've got links to this lesson plan itself. So if you just go to Cult of Pedagogy, click on podcast, go to episode 121, and you will find links to it. It's a great plan. So although the original plan says it's for a single day, it relies heavily on homework the night before and the night after to actually make that happen. So if you move the homework activities into class time, it would basically make it about a 1 week set of lessons, especially if you let some of the sort of discussions actually develop. So I sort of made this into a 1 week lesson plan. Okay. So number one, the first activity is called rephrasing the Bill of Rights. And this is just going to take about half a class period. In this activity, students receive a copy of the Bill of Rights and they translate each amendment into their own contemporary language. This task is at the understand level because students are interpreting the rights into their own language. Again, some lower level thinking is going to be part of any learning cycle. So this set of plans will also include some activities in the lower levels. With that said, work at the understand level is still more cognitively complex than the remember level. This activity does push students to do more than simply copy down the information. So they rewrite them into their own language. And then the second activity is called the Value of Rights handout. This is another half class period. So these two combined just take the first day. Students choose the 5 rights they think are most important and rank them from most to least important. Then they answer a few questions about why they made these choices. A class discussion follows where students are asked to consider whether other factors like age or family situation would change their answers if they were different from their current life. This activity is at the evaluate level because students are making judgments about the relative importance of the amendments. The third activity is scenario cards, and this would take about a full class period. In this activity, students work in groups to read cards that describe various scenarios and identify which right is being violated in each one and which amendment offers protection for that right. This activity is at the understand level because students are just being asked to classify each scenario as an example of a specific right. So the next activity is called the Bill of Rights today, and that takes 1 class period also. So where we are right now is in the middle of the week. This would be the 3rd day of this little unit. The Bill of Rights today has students do this. Students must locate 5 current news stories related to the Bill of Rights. For each one, they will need to summarize the story, identify which amendment is related to the story, and discuss how the issue might touch their own lives. Although this activity is similar to the one before it, having students classify stories by the most relevant amendment, this task is a bit more complex because the scenarios here are not pre-screened for them. Students will have to find their own articles and dig through irrelevant details to determine which amendment is most clearly illustrated in the articles. That kind of work takes this activity closer to the analysis level. The 5th activity is called Life Without Stories, and this takes 1 to 2 class periods. After reading a short story called Life Without Rights for the Accused, which illustrates life in a society where government does not honor the criminal procedure protections in the Bill of Rights, students write their own stories about what life would be like if citizens didn't have one particular right. This activity is at the create level. Students are using their knowledge of our current rights and how they play out in everyday life to imagine a different society where those rights are not present. So those are the 2 different sets of plans. Even though both sets of plans take about the same amount of time to teach, the after set gives students many more opportunities to engage deeply with the content. And students in that classroom are more likely to finish the week with an enduring, transferable understanding of their constitutional rights. If you were walking past both classrooms, it might look like the kids making their own websites are doing more engaging 21st century work. But cognitively, those websites don't demand much from students at all. So here's kind of my final word on this whole thing. When we are striving to develop deeper, more rigorous learning experiences for our students, It is easy to get bogged down in trying to figure out exactly which level a task fits into or which verb is the most accurate. If you find yourself spending way too long on the labeling aspect of planning, it's time to stop and refocus on a different question. What do I want students to be able to do with this knowledge once this lesson is over? In other words, why are they learning this stuff? How do I want them to transfer that learning to real life? And how can I replicate those uses in a classroom activity? Let's consider the Bill of Rights again. We want our citizens to understand their rights so that when their rights or the rights of people they know are violated, they'll recognize it and be able to take action. This is one of the ways we participate in a democratic society, right? So an activity where students look at sample situations and identify which rights are being infringed upon is one way to have them transfer their knowledge of the Bill of Rights into new situations, cases that might be similar to things they may experience themselves. Finding more articles from current publications can extend that learning even further. And what about the create task in the after lesson? What is the value of having students write a story about life without one of the freedoms granted by the Bill of Rights? This kind of activity deepens their understanding of their rights. Rather than simply recopying the same information into a new package, they're being asked to actively imagine a different life from the one they're living, with one significant right removed from it. That kind of exercise gets them to think more about how these rights actually impact their day-to-day lives, which is a far more complex task than recalling the list of rights from what they were taught. The after lesson presented here is just one example of how to build more higher order thinking into students' learning experiences. It can be done in lots of ways, and the goal isn't to always hit every level. Instead, choose activities that will get students working with the material in ways that will serve them later in life. So the next time Ms. Jackson teaches figurative language, she can skip the wire hangers and just have students use figurative language in their own personal narratives, poems, or essays. The writing won't necessarily make the classroom any prettier, but for the rest of their lives, those kids may be more likely to use better metaphors, personification, and alliteration to make their writing more powerful. College essays, professional presentations, even love letters, which is kind of the point, isn't it? For links to the resources mentioned in this podcast, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 121. To get a weekly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening and have a great day.